Hello, my name is Ken Nowak. I'm a former president of Variety FoodServices. I was president for approximately 30 years. I've been asked at different times what I think of in terms of when I hear the word Variety FoodServices. And actually, I guess there's a couple of words that I think of. One is sacrifice, and the opposite is reward. The sacrifice didn't come on my part, but on my dad's, who founded the company in 1928 and worked 6 days a week for his whole life and was doing all the building and putting in the foundation for what we have today. He didn't live long enough to see the rewards that I have seen in my tour with Variety and that I still see in the company today.
Hello, I'm Don Nowak. I have been with Variety Vending all my life because my dad was the founder of Variety Vending. Not only that, I've had the pleasure of working with my brother all my life, and I look at that as probably one of the best things that could have ever happened to me throughout the years. I was vice president with Variety, involved primarily with operations and technical services.
As you can see, there are many necessary parts to putting together a good food service puzzle.
As I mentioned, when I think of Variety, I think of how fortunate I was. Not only did my father start the business, but it turned out to be the largest independently owned food service company in the area.
Variety was founded by my dad, who was quite a unique person, worked hard, had a background that was rather tough in that when he was 15, his dad died, and he had to go to work because he was one of 7 siblings.
Not only was he a graduate accountant from the University of Detroit, he was the first man to ever graduate from the University of Detroit without having a high school education. There was some controversy about that just prior to his graduation because they didn't know it up until then. But they finally decided that yes, he should get be graduated and get a certificate.
I can remember more than once when my mother would ask him, when are we going to see some results from all the work in the business? And his answer to her was, we're not going to. That'll be the kids that see the results and get the rewards of the business.
Dad was a great guy to work for, not only with me, but with all the employees. He worked with them all. He didn't believe in telling them to do this or do that. He would actually do it himself. There were very few things that he didn't do that he would depend on one of the employees only to do. He wasn't extremely demanding, but he wanted the job done right and done well. He was a great guy to work for, and he had a terrific rapport with all his customers. He never had a contract with somebody to get their business. It was a handshake, and that was it. Everybody trusted him.
He would work 6 days a week and come home, and they'd be having guests over the house to play cards. And my mother would still be way behind in straightening things up around the house and so forth. And he would just hang his hat and coat up and say, oh, gee, you're way behind, aren't you? And just jump right in. And he might scrub the kitchen floor or start dusting in dining room or something like that. And never a reprimand to my mother, never saying, how come this isn't done, or you should have this done by now, or something like that. He just saw that there was a need for more help, and he would pitch in spite of the fact that he worked all day.
I would say he was a good mechanic. He, and not only on vending machines and related to business, but everything around the house, at home. He repaired everything on his own. Didn't have to call a plumber or call an electrician or whatever it might be. He did it. Where he got that knowledge, I have no idea.
Well, his working from the house, I don't think made things any more complicated for us as family members, but it certainly was much more complicated for him because he had to carry everything up and down the steps, down the basement, up to outside, and it was a little more involved from a delivery standpoint when people would be delivering products to us and so forth. And originally they'd walk around the back of the house and down the steps in the basement and so forth. And then my dad got the idea of making sort of a little slide out of a couple of 2x12s that he made brackets that he could hang right on the basement window after he opened it on the ledge, so that when these deliveries would come, we just open the basement window and put these 2x12s up there, and they would just slide them right down to the basement, and then we'd take them from there and put them over on a shelf. Well, Dad started at Variety in 1928, and his motivation was that he was out of work. He had been laid off. He worked, I believe, for a couple of different companies. He worked for a fox farm.
In those days, fox pelts were very popular for coats, particularly women, but men as well wore a lot of fur coats. He was with them for a few years when they came upon hard times and went out of business. They couldn't pay him any money, so they gave him a typewriter and an adding machine, and that was part of the startup of his business, I assume.
And he also worked for a paint company, and he was without work, and he got the idea of selling some things like peanuts to the bars and so forth. So he started packaging peanuts in little cellophane bags and taking them around. They had a little rack that they'd put the peanuts on in the bars, and they would sell them that way. He then, from that point, ventured into vending machines.
He saw an ad in the paper from a company in Chicago called Cohen Vending Machine Manufacturers. And when he thought of the vending machine, he thought, gee, that sounds like something interesting. There weren't many of them around at that time at all, I'm sure.
The thing that interested him in the vending was that it was a cash business. So many businesses were going bankrupt, not because they were unprofitable, but because they didn't have the cash flow because of the lack of receivables being paid to them. And being an accountant, he thought that the vending business would have no receivables, and that hazard would be eliminated.
So he wrote a letter to the company and told him that he had an idea. He saw the ad for the vending machines and thought that if he put them on the streetcars in the city of Detroit, would be a good location for a vending machine. People are sitting there riding distances most of the time and looking for a snack, and he wanted to put them on the streetcars. And of course, he explained to in his letter that unfortunately he didn't have any capital, but he would like to do that if possible. The gentleman's name that was manufacturing the machines was J.W. Cohen, and he wrote him back and indicated that he had started his business in a somewhat similar manner, and liked Dad's attitude and the way he wrote the letter, and said he was shipping them 3 machines and would like to have him experiment with that. And that's how he got into the vending business, actually. However, after getting several machines on the different streetcars, they learned real quickly that those streetcars in the evenings were brought into what they called the car barns, put in the car barns and locked up. And of course, in the warm or hot weather particularly, everything in the machine melted. Candy back then was real chocolate, and it couldn't stand any heat at all.
As the business grew, we not only needed larger buildings, but we needed more manpower. So Dad got a cousin of his who was out of work to come and work with him. So they had the 2 of them that were making deliveries. A few years later, I don't know exactly when, my dad's brother, Vincent, joined the company. As I recall, he was working at Dodge Motors, and I think he was laid off. And so he came to work. I don't know if it was originally thought of as in terms of permanent employment or not, or just temporary, but he did stay on for quite a few years. When my dad first founded the company, it wasn't called Variety FoodServices, it was called Tasty Snacks. And then a few years later, they changed the name to Variety Vendors. Then after that, the name was changed to Variety Vending and Food Services. And then it was changed to Variety FoodServices, which it is today. Well, Dad started the company just on pennies and nickels and dimes, I think, because he didn't have much money. He lost his house during the Depression, and had to move in with my grandfather, my mother's parents, and so he wouldn't have had much money to start in the business. But in starting with the peanuts that he was dispensing and so forth, he didn't have much initial cost, and so it was an opportunity to make some money that way without making too much of a capital investment. And originally he worked right out of his home. He worked out of the basement of the home he lived in on Glenwood in Detroit, or right near Gratiot.
And then went to a building over on Griner, which was the first building he had ever gotten into.
I don't know how many years they were, when they actually moved there, or how long they were there, but I would say I know that from that location they moved to another larger building on Connor Avenue, maybe about a half mile off of Gratiot, right across the street from the old Hudson Car Company.
I remember that building very well because we used to go down there. It was nothing for Dad to work on a Sunday, to get caught up on probably bookwork, I assume, because they were out on the road most of the days all week. But Ken and I, my brother Ken, were down there with him one Sunday, and we were across the street where there was a big lawn in front of a Hudson Motor Car Company. And we would go across the street and play catch over there with a football or whatever we had with us at the time. And all of a sudden, there seemed to be a lot of extra commotion. We went back across to the building, and they had the radio on.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, by air, President Roosevelt has just announced. The attack also was made on all naval and military activities on the principal island of Oahu.
The Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor, and we were officially in World War II. And that was in 1941.
They were there a number of years, I know, and then they moved to a larger building over on approximately 6 Mile and Van Dyke. And that, I would say they moved over there probably in about 1947 or so.
They moved from there over to a little larger building on Wilfred Street, right at the corner of Gratiot Avenue, just a few blocks north of the Detroit City Airport. That was a much larger building they had been in prior.
We remained there for quite a few years until about 1969 or 70, when we acquired a larger building in the city of Warren on Hoover Road in 10 Mile, which the company is still presently located at, although they've expanded the building.
Vending was always a very interesting, challenging occupation as far as I was concerned. I liked the fact that you always had something new. It seemed like every day something new came up, a different challenge. Not only with equipment and locations, but with people. One of the biggest downfalls with the coin mechanisms in the machines were that it was very easy to use some sort of a slug, and in particular a washer. I don't think my dad ever, and I don't recall even after I got into the business ever, buying a washer for any application. We always had cigar boxes full of them that we had gotten, particularly in the penny machines, you would get them. They would work occasionally in the nickel machines. However, more often they would just jam them up, and then you'd end up running a service call. Most machines at that time would only vend for one price. After a few years and prices start to increase some, in order to change the price, you had to purchase a retrofit for the coin mech. There were several of those made by different companies. Some of them worked quite well, and others drove you crazy a lot of time. But it probably was only back when they come out with the first cigarette machines, or at least when we got involved in the first cigarette machines, that you could buy a cigarette machine with a pricing mechanism on it that could actually be adjusted or modified right then and there to a different price. And until later years, when they start coming out with multiple price machines, coin mechanisms were very, very simple. Once they came out with the multiple price machines, of course, the coin mechanisms had to be much more sophisticated. As I mentioned, biggest problem we had with most of the vending machines were coin problems. And that even became a bigger problem when we got into the cigarette machine, because when cigarette prices were raised, they were usually raised a penny, 2 cents, maybe 3 cents at a time. They weren't raised in nickel increments, so the machine itself could not be priced properly. You change the prices, you had to work in nickel increments. So someone came up with the idea of putting change, pennies, into the cigarette package. If the cigarette was, or the package in those days was 15 cents, as I remember, and it went to 17 cents. So we had to charge 20. In order to do that, we had to put 3 pennies in the pack of cigarettes for change. The machine itself could not make change. So we had them, initially we were sliding them in under the cellophane in the package by hand, which of course real quickly became obvious that you just couldn't afford to do that. Tremendous time consumption. They did come up with a machine that you could slide the package up to a little razor blade that would slice the top corner of the plastic, and at the same time shoot 3 pennies underneath the cellophane. But the big problem with it was, once you got the cigarette package in the machine, was keeping the pennies in the package. And we ended up then with a big problem of service calls, because the pennies would fall out and get into the mechanism in the machine, and of course jam the cigarette machine. So you had to be kind of handle the cigarettes in those days like eggs. You wanted to make sure when you took them out of the carton, you didn't dare catch the package on the edge of the carton and tear the cellophane or slit it a little bit so that the penny would slide out. But it was the only answer we had at the time, and it worked reasonably well.
Customer changed from looking at vending as a service that they received free of charge. They began to look at it as a service that they could make money from by getting a commission from the vending company. But that led to a new problem, and that was that we had many people in the business that were not that honest or ethical. And I can remember acquiring a couple of bars because I happened to be going by a bar, and I saw a truck from a competitor that I knew was cutting corners. And he'd be in there servicing the cigarette machine. So I'd wait till he'd leave, and then I'd go into the bar and just buy a Coke or something. And then I'd go over to the wastebasket that was nearest the cigarette machine. And generally, these guys, when they fill a cigarette machine, they were just, a little bit lazy. So when they would take the cigarettes out of a carton and put them into the machine, they would take all the cartons and flatten them out and put them in the wastebasket. So I could count the number of cartons that he put in the machine, which would be an indication of how much it sold. So I would talk with the bartender and mention what the cigarettes service, and are you happy with it and so forth, and he said, well, it's, as far as things go, it's pretty good and so forth, and I said, do you have any idea how much you sell a week? He said, yeah, I'll tell you exactly. So he goes over and picks up a piece of paper off the cash register that the other guy had left in there. He said, we sold 15 cartons this week. And I said, that's strange. He said, because there's 20 empty cartons over in the wastebasket right there. And he looked at me, and then he went over and pulled them out of the wastebasket and counted them. He said, son of a SOB, and so forth. No, what he meant. He says, you got machines? Do you have machines? I said, yes. He said, bring one in. So that happened a couple of times.
Penny gum machines prior to the war were single stick gum machines. They were kind of tricky to service from the point of refilling. You had to take single sticks. You would try to get 12 to 15 of them between your fingers and slide them down in a little track that they would fit in. And of course, you were always in a hurry, so you figured if you could do 15, you probably could do 20 or 25. And invariably, when you did that, well, you ended up shooting the sticks of gum all over the floor. We were able to pick them up and put them back in. In those days, it didn't people didn't seem to mind as much as you do today. They weren't as health conscious or what at that time. The peanut machines, which were also a penny machine, had a large globe on it, poured the peanuts into it, and you put in a penny and got a measured amount of peanuts. The biggest mechanical problems, and not necessarily mechanical, but biggest maintenance problem with them were they had to be cleaned frequently because of the oils in the peanuts. It would mess up the globe, number one, but it would also get down in all the mechanism, which were nothing but springs and levers, and many times to the point if you didn't clean them often enough, you had a service call, the machine was out of order. I think the biggest mistake we made, and I say we, Ken and I were involved at that time, although my dad was still very much involved, was not getting into the coffee vending business at that time. We were offered up to that point there were no coffee machines, and one manufacturer came up called Quick Cafe with a coffee machine, and wondered if we would be interested in it was a franchise type of thing. And they brought a machine in and set it up in the office for us and left it there for, I don't know, a couple of weeks or maybe 3. And of course, my dad, being the type of guy that he wasn't going to take advantage of anybody or push anything down anybody's throat unless he thought it was a good thing. And he was a coffee drinker. And he just thought it was the lousiest cup of coffee that he ever had, as well as the rest of us there. I don't recall, I wasn't a big coffee drinker at the time, but I couldn't imagine how anybody could drink it. It was a frozen concentrate, but it was an extremely strong cup of coffee, and there was no way of changing that at the time. And so we, Dad primarily, decided he didn't want to do that. That'd leave a bad name for the business, so we didn't. And of course, it turned out to be a big mistake. Every time we got a call for somebody wanted a coffee machine, we would refer them to the person who took that franchise after it was offered to us, and ended up making him a multimillionaire because he was the only one with the coffee machines around, and ran them for years. We did eventually get into the coffee business through another manufacturer, but the ground floor, which was the floor you should have been on with that, we never got into.
I'm frequently asked what was the business like during the wartime. Sugar was rationed, so that meant the manufacturers could only produce so much product, and therefore they would ration to the end users, such as we were, so much of what they could produce, based on what our purchases were prior to the shortage. So we never were able to get as much as we wanted to. So the fact that the plants were working longer hours and there were more of them, we still could not service as much as many of them as we'd like to because of just the lack of product. And of course, we also, at that time, we had gas rationing too, so we had to kind of take business that was within the area that we were servicing. We couldn't just drive from one end of this one city to another city to provide the service because it ate up too much gas.
After the war, when you could finally get product again, because of the war, everything was rationed, and we had a lot of trouble getting product. Gas was a problem. That was rationed also. So you did not see a whole lot of growth in the business when most other businesses were just booming. We were struggling to get enough product to keep the doors open, so to speak. But after the war, because of the fact that my dad had by then already built a very good reputation as one of the better vendors in the area, we were getting a lot of phone calls and referrals from other people for vending. We never had actual vending salesperson other than my dad and his one partner, and the sales calls that they made, I believe, were all word of mouth or phone calls that we had gotten that they went out and answered. So things started to grow quite rapidly at that time.
One of the things that we did to deal with the gas rationing is that convert from using our private cars to using trucks, because if you had a truck, you got a greater allocation of gasoline.
At that time, they heard of a bakery company in Flint that went out of business and were selling some panel trucks. So they went up there and bought 4 of them at the time. There were 3 1937 Ford panel trucks and 1 1939. But it was going from the cars to the trucks was a major change in the way they were able to operate. By that time, they had hired a young fella to come and work for him named Bruce Burberg. I believe he was 19 or 20 years old, which was the ideal age for getting drafted into the service, but he had been hurt playing ball and could not serve. He was rejected, so they hired him. And he worked for him all through the war and through the time, biggest part of the time over there on 6 Mile Road.
My dad, Norman Nowak, better known as Norm or Shorty, operated the business out of the basement by himself for many years with some little assistance from my mother. He later, in probably the early 30s, had a cousin join him in the business named William Emick, who remained with him for many years. And then in the late 30s, his youngest brother, Vincent, better known as Vin, joined the business and became a full-time employee. And he also worked for many years in the company. So it was pretty much a one-man operation of Dad until the time that his cousin and brother joined him. And Bill Emick, Dad's cousin, joined the business. I'm sure he basically did the same types of things that Dad did in terms of trying to gain new customers, and likewise going around and restocking peanut racks and peanut machines and gum machines. And in later years, he was basically in sales in a little different nature, but he was primary responsibility was the administration and the accounting in the company until the time that he retired. Dad's brother Vin was instrumental in expanding the geographic area of our service because he lived out in Royal Oak, and that area was just starting to develop, so he was able to secure a lot of new business out in that area. And Vin substantially just ran a route of restocking of vending machines and repairing of some. He left the company in the probably mid-50s because he had a drinking problem that was significantly interfering with his responsibilities. And the only solution was he had been warned several times, and finally, with some extra urging on the part of Don and I, that the future of the company was in jeopardy if we don't correct the problem. My dad had him leave, terminated him, which must have been a very tough job for my dad when I think back at it, because Vincent wasn't even born when Norm's dad died. So that meant that Norm was both brother and probably father to Vin. So to terminate him must have been an extremely difficult job, which I realized later on in life. Unfortunately, Vin was not the only one that had a drinking problem. Dad's partner, Bill Amick, also was afflicted with having difficulty of drinking too much, which created a lot of absenteeism for him. And right up until the time he retired, he was drinking excessively. There were times in probably the mid-50s when my dad was ill, and Bill was the only one that could sign checks, and Bill was not there. So I would sign his name on the check so that we could buy cigarettes or pay employees or so forth. That went on for quite a few years. We talked about some employees. Don, my brother, talked about a number of them. There's no way we could identify all of them because, over the period of years that we were involved in the business, it would be, we'd surely overlook some people. But we had a lot of people that I guess my board of directors today, or John's board of directors, I should say, would probably call as, true soldiers. Yeah, we had an awful lot of people that were fully dependable and would go out of their way to be helpful, were hardworking, honest, and sure, some of them had some individual education limitations, but they were working soldiers.
One of the most loyal employees that Variety ever had, I believe, was a fellow named Oliver Tank, known as Ollie.
Ollie was with Variety for over 40 years. Hardly ever missed any work. I don't know if he actually ever did. He was willing to do anything and whatever he could, but really was a building block that you need to grow a company, because you need people like that you can depend upon, that you don't need to worry about they're going to jump to a competitor.
Ollie came to us after the war. He got out of service and started working for us after the war. He turned out, after running a route for a while, we took a real step forward. I say we, I should say my dad and Bill. They had a contact that Bill had made with the people that were running the cafeteria in the General Motors Turnstead plant. And they wanted us to put a bunch of machines in the Turnstead plant. Well, that was a real big operation. We had never done anything like that before, the amount of equipment and what have you. But anyway, Dad and Bill decided that it was a golden opportunity, so they did it, and they did. Ollie then went to run that operation, and he did. He was over there for several years, as long as we had the account, and worked right out of his house. He went from his house right to Turnstead, had a little small room over there for a warehouse, and worked right out of the plant. Came Saturdays and picked up whatever he was going to need for the week and took it out and stocked it in the warehouse. When we lost that account, then of course Ollie came back into the operation, and we put him in charge of maintenance. He was in charge of all the maintenance people, ran all service calls, ran service calls, along with some others. But he was the kind of guy who never ever had to call him or say, "Where are you?" or never called in sick. Was always there, always on the job. I think of him often because only then did it get to the point where Ken and I could actually leave the building at night and know that it was going to be in good condition and locked up properly and everything after that. Ollie was with us for 50 some years. I think it was 52. He had a very bad experience. He also worked every Saturday. He worked 6 days a week. He worked every Saturday, and on Saturday we normally only had a maintenance or person or two in the building. And one Saturday while he was there, we had a holdup. Some guys came in armed, tied him up, locked him up in a bathroom, and held, took whatever they could get out of the building. I thought at the time we probably were going to lose him to retirement. However, he, after a few weeks, he got his wits about him again and came back and spent several years longer with us.
Some of the key people in the history of Variety sometimes were not long-term employees, but they were key people because they were the type of people we needed at that particular time. I think of two or three right offhand. One was a salesman named Chuck Royal. He came on board with us, and he was just very professional in his traits and so forth, but very naive in terms of what the business was about. And I remember having a sales meeting and talking to him and a couple other salespeople about some strategies and plans for the sales department and so forth. And at that time, General Motors was building a new facility in Detroit it was a Cadillac plant, and it was half of it was in Detroit and half of it was in Hamtramck. So it got the nickname of Pole Town Plant. And it was supposed to have about 4,000 employees. And so at the sales meeting, I was talking about the type of customers that we wanted and the minimum number and so forth, and to support the equipment that we were putting in. And all of a sudden he said, this Chuck said, Ken, wouldn't that new GM Pole Town plant going up, wouldn't that be a good location? And my first reaction was to say, forget it, it's out of our league, And I thought, just shut your mouth. The answer is yes, tell them yes. So I said, sure, yeah, that'd be an excellent location. Well, next thing I know, he comes in, he says, hey, I got an appointment with the food purchaser for General Motors regarding that Pole Town plant. He said, maybe you ought to come along with me because I'm kind of new at this, So I went with him and so forth. We had a very receptive meeting. I was shocked. And to kind of not belittle or to shorten the story, we ended up securing that plant. We were awarded the contract for this huge new General Motors plant, which was our first real big automotive plant. And it was through his open-mindedness and believing that what we did, we could do for them, and us being able to demonstrate that we could do it, and we operated for several years, many years after that.
They hired a friend of my dad's who really was more like a brother. He lost his parents, both parents. My grandmother took him in and raised him, even though she was a widow at the time with 7 children. They had kind of lost contact with each other over as they got older in teen years. And one day Dad was downtown working, obviously. He was walking down the street, and he ran into the fellow that I called his brother all the time, Rich Schwerner, and got talking to him. And Rich was not doing anything at the time, and Dad said, why don't you come out and see where we're at, on Connors Avenue. Well, he did that, and then before you know it, he was coming out there every other day or so just to visit. So at the time, Dad felt he could use somebody, so he asked him if he would like to come to work. He did, and ended up staying with Dad and with Variety, I think, for over 30 years.
I was talking about faithful soldiers. Another one would probably be my sister Carlene, who's been with us for many years, worked in both the money room and in the commissary.
Over the years, we've had many, many excellent employees. Some of them quite entertaining at times. Some real episodes, not intentionally, but kind of comical. One that I recall vividly, we had a mechanic working for us named Gene Wyke. He was a little bit overweight. Usually had to remind him that his shirt was coming out in the front, particularly because the pants were way down below the stomach line. But one day he and I went out on an install out in Dearborn. I don't recall the name of the company. We were going to install a coffee machine. When we got out there, we found out that the only water line that we could tie into for water was in the ceiling, in the office, in the main office. And so we were there in the morning, wanted to do it, and asked us if we could please come back and do it at lunchtime, because the people would not be, there would not be so many people in the, actually in the office. So we did. We waited, but where we went, I don't know. We made another stop and came back. We came back at lunchtime and got in there. We borrowed a ladder to get up into the ceiling. You had to remove the ceiling tiles. And Gene says, "I'll get it." He says, I can get this. I'll go up. I said, okay. So Gene got up on the ladder. He moved the tile away, got himself up so that the upper part of his body was in the ceiling. You didn't see it. I was standing down the bottom of the ladder, kind of holding it steady. And there were probably a dozen young ladies in the office who hadn't gone to lunch. And he had to stretch. He couldn't quite reach the water pipe. And as he stretched up, his pants fell down, came down around his ankles. Of course, somebody had to notice it and let out a yell. And unfortunately, they were down around his ankles, and he couldn't move his feet to get back down the ladder. I don't really remember exactly how he finally came down off of that ladder, but everybody in the building, of course, by that time was in there to see what was going on, and everybody roaring about as much as I was. Gene didn't bother him a bit. He pulled his pants back up finally, and we went back to work and got the machine installed. Probably that was one of the funniest episodes that I recall.
We had a guy that started out as a route man with us named Ralph Harris. Later became our first salesman. But to give you the idea of the type of route man he was, when a customer's machine would run empty, they wouldn't call up and say the machine was empty. They would call up and ask if Ralph was there. And if we tell them no, that he wasn't in the building, they would ask that he call them. So at the end of the day, when Ralph would come in, I'd ask him, what was the problem over at ABC or company, or that called in today. He said, "Oh, there's no problem. The machines were just empty." Now, most places would call up and scream that the machines were empty and complain about the route man. But with him, they wouldn't even tell whoever would answer the telephone that the machines were empty, because they didn't want to get them in any trouble.
Way back, we had a fella working for us, I should say Dad had. I was working at the time, but I was still in school. But anyway, his name was Art Bruley. He had been working in a gas station that was an account of Dad's. And he was bugging Dad about a job, wanted to go to work for him, So finally, there came a time when Dad felt he could use him, so he hired him. He was a very good mechanic, auto mechanic, but at that time we didn't have full-time mechanics. It was Dad and one other fella, and they did it in between other jobs. But anyway, he was a route man. He was down on Jefferson Avenue, and he drove a Model T Ford, and was running late, and cop pulled him over for speeding down Jefferson Avenue, and asked him where was his big hurry, and he said, well, had a couple more stops he had to make. He was delivering, and he had a couple more stops, and he said, they're going to be waiting for me at the office because I got to get in there before they lock up. And the officer says, well, he said, you know you were speeding, and he said, yes, I know I was. And he asked him how his brakes were, and he says, well, the brakes are fine, my brakes are fine. He says, let me get in there and try them. So Art got out of the car and stood down there, and the cop got up to jump in and caught his leg on a spring that was sticking out on the side of the seat. Big tore down his pants, and Art said, oh boy, I'm in trouble now. Well, cop didn't make too much of it, but anyway, he was talking about various things, and Art finally told me, he said, I got to get going. He said, I got to get back to the office before they want to lock up. And he said, don't get too huffy with me. He said, we all got things we got to do, but he said, this is my job, I got to stop you. And Art was the kind of guy that he wasn't going to give up easy. So in the course of conversations, he finally irritated him enough, and he says, what are you going to do if I take this car away from you and pawn it? He said, what are you going to do then? He said, I'll go down the street and get another one for $25. Well, then the cop said, okay. So he took him into the station, had him waiting in the station, and then he started giving these people in the police station a little hassle for holding him up. So finally we got a call from him. He was on his way back. They let him out, and he'd come back to the office, and I can't use the words that he used when he got back into the office, but he was extremely upset. He ended up with getting a court date and the whole works. But Art was that kind of guy. He, whether it was a policeman or who it was, he had a job to do, and he was going to get it done one way or another.
We had a controller named Jim McCubry, who was I think the controller or vice president for finance for Federal Department stores, and after that for Meyer Jewelry. And when I interviewed him, I thought, geez, this guy is way overqualified for what we got. But I'll talk to him anyway. So I talked to him, and he really did seem interested. So anyway, I hired him, and wow, he was, the guy was just so skilled and such a workhorse that, he just whipped our accounting records and things in just unbelievable fashion. We'd have a situation, for example, where we're trying to keep track of a route driver's products issued in the machines he serviced and so forth, and all of a sudden his truck breaks down, so he has to switch and use a spare truck, and he's got a different load on it and so forth. So it means under our old system that we just lost control that week. But he rectified that. It took him quite a while, but he rectified that. He had to just put a check in a box, and that the load from the one truck got switched to the other truck, and we could still have total accountability for it. But he wasn't with us too many years, developed cancer, died very quickly, but he was definitely a very instrumental in raising the professional standards of the administration and the financial controls of the company. We had a woman named Clara Fox. I used to kid Clara. She came to work for us on December 8th, 1941. And, you know, after she was with us for 30, 35 years, I told her that, you know, once the war started, we hired anybody. And she was my sounding board for new procedures in the money room. If I had a new idea of how to do something in terms of speeding up the counting of money and keeping the records and so forth, I would go ask her, and if she would be totally against it, I would do it, because it seems like I had that she had 100% batting average of being against things initially, and then after a couple of weeks into it would say how wonderful it was. So if she told me something was wonderful to begin with, I was a little nervous, but if she told me that you know, that would be terrible, if she didn't want to do that, that was my sign that I should probably give it a chance.
We had several people that were good employees, but just different. Another one, a route driver that I don't recall his name, but we had there. One day we got a notice from the union that they had a grievance filed. We had never ever had a grievance filed with us from an employee, but this employee filed a grievance. So they called up and said we'd have to have a meeting and get together. They talked to Ken, and they did tell him who the fellow was that filed the grievance. So when he came in off the route that day, Ken called him in and talked to him. He said, what's going on here? He said, what's the matter? What are you unhappy with? Oh, he says, oh, don't worry about that. Don't worry. He says, I just realized that you never had a grievance filed against you. So he said, I wanted to be the first one to file a grievance. So there was no grievance. He just wanted to cause some commotion, I guess. My Aunt Beatrice started working with him.
To become sort of the office person who held the fort down while they were gone, and accepted deliveries, and also counted the coins and so forth and deposited them in the bank, which was a sizable job because we didn't have any automatic counting equipment in those days. It was all done at a table by hand.
She worked with them for quite a few years. I believe it was probably into the 50s, late 50s. Then she got married and left the business.
You might be interested in knowing a few things that stand out in my mind over the years. Don told some stories that were kind of key and very memorable things, such as another occasion where Don and my Uncle Ben and I were moving a drink machine, which was one of the heavier types of machines in those days, down a double flight of stairs at American Can in Detroit. And the machine was so heavy, it took three of us, and so my uncle got on one side of the machine, I got on the other side, and we had the machine on a dolly, and then we had a rope that had to be at least an inch and a half thick that was tied around the dolly and then up to the top of the stairway and around a steel post, so that Ben and I would just kind of ease it down a step, and then Don would release a little bit of the rope at the same time. Well, we get about a third of the way down the steps, maybe 25% or maybe, but it was just near the beginning and going down this double flight of stairs, and it was a straight flight of stairs. It wasn't a typical stairway of going down to a landing and then going down another flight. It was a full 2 stories of straight steps. And the rope broke. And of course, the two of us, Ben and I, could not keep the machine from going down, so it came right at us. The good news is that we both got out of the way of it, in spite of the fact that it was a narrow stairway. We both slammed up against the outer part, and the machine went right down in front of us. I guess the only casualty was the fact that I couldn't hear for 10 minutes. I didn't get hit or anything, but I guess just the shock of it or something caused me to lose my hearing. So that certainly was an experience that I wouldn't want to repeat. Another experience that I can remember is during the war years and shortly after, when we would go into a factory or office building to service the vending machines, we would carry the candy in to fill the machines, and we would have sold it all before we got to the machine. By the time we got to the machine, we didn't have any candy left anymore, so we didn't even have to open the machine, because people were so desirous of buying chocolate bars and candy that they when they would see us coming in the door, they would just stop their work and come over and buy from us right away, trying to beat their fellow workers over. And so when the time we got the machine, we just turned around and went back out.
Both of Dad's partners, Bill and Vin, were somewhat of characters as well, funny characters in many, many ways. I remember one episode particularly with Bill and Vin. It was while Dad was, shortly after he had had his first heart attack, was not back to work yet, and there was an NAMA convention going on. Bill and Vin wanted to go, and they wanted me to go with them, which surprised me in a way, but I was glad to go with them. Afterwards, I realized that they were looking for somebody to kind of watch them, I think, while they were there. They liked to party a bit. But coming out of leaving the convention and coming out to catch the airplane, go to the airport, we got up to the airport, and that was just about the time they had started to put in automatic doors on the airports, the entrances to the airports. And Bill was carrying a cane with him, which he frequently did. I don't know that he needed it or not, but he had it with him. He walked up to the door. We were a little late. He was hustling, and he went to shove the door open, and just as he did that, the door flew open, and his forward momentum carried him into the center of the airport lobby. The cane was swinging around in different directions and clipped a man going by, clipped his hat, flipped it right up in the air and down on the floor. And of course, everybody in the airport just applauded. They thought he was pulling some kind of trick or something. Unfortunately, he wasn't. He just lost his balance and went in, hit the hat, knocked it off. It's been stuck in my mind forever. Vin also was a character. He was a fun-loving guy. He didn't have an enemy in the world that I know of. I used to bowl with him, and one year he broke his arm. He was a pretty good bowler. He broke his arm, so he started bowling left-handed. And before you know it, he was bowling as good left-handed as he was right-handed. At the end of the season, he had won a few prizes, and of course most of the other bowlers thought it was not right that he would get a prize because they were giving him a pretty sizable spot for having to bowl with his left hand. Got into the beverage business, cup soda vending business. At that time was quite big. There was a representative from Coca-Cola who knew of a drugstore out in Mount Clemens that had purchased a machine and put it in their drugstore instead of having a fountain, thinking that the people would be interested in having a drink while they were in the drugstore. It didn't work out for them. They only had it a short time, and he approached us. He said it'd be an opportune time to get into the cup soda vending machine business. He said we could get that machine relatively inexpensive. The man wanted to get rid of it, and said he thought, we should do it. We did. Ken, my brother, and I went out there with a trailer one day, as we did whenever we were going to move a machine around any place. Backed up to the curb right in front of the drugstore, and the machine was on wheels. And we wheeled it out and got it to the back of the trailer, and we had maybe 6 inches at the most to get it up onto the trailer. And we could not move it. We couldn't tilt it. The thing was so heavy. With that, we saw a couple of fellas coming down the street alongside the drugstore, so Ken called them, and he said, hey, you guys want to make a few cents here? He said, we need some help getting this thing on a trailer. And they were very congenial, very willing to do so, and they did. They helped us get it on the trailer. We got it on and brought it back to the shop. Got it off the trailer at the shop and inside, and we had made arrangements with the Coke representative that as soon as we got it, he would come in and go through it and train us on it, and it works. We gave him a call, and he did. He came down the next day or two, opened it up, and started to explain different portions of it, what was what, cup mechanism, coin mechanism, tanks, it was a syrup vending machine, and where you put the syrup and this, that, and he looked and he said, we got to fill the water bath. And we kind of looked at him, and he said, right here. He said, this, and he stopped. He said, oh, heck, he said, you got this thing full already. We said, we didn't do anything. He said, you what? I said, we didn't do anything with that. We didn't put it, didn't touch it. He said, you mean you moved it with all that water in there? It had a big reservoir for water that when you plugged the machine in and got the power to it, refrigeration unit come on and froze that to a block of ice to keep the syrup and everything cold. So he said, how did you ever move that thing that way? We said, well, we had a heck of a time, but we got it down here. It was our first experience in cup vending, but it panned out to be a very good machine and worked very well, and we ended up getting into the cup soda business that way.
Both Don and I got an early start in the business. We both started working after school in about 1945. And then after high school, we started working full-time until we went into service. Don went in 1951 and got out in 53, and I went in 52 and got out in 54. And 1954 was when my dad had his first heart attack. He was attending the National Automatic Merchandising Association convention in Washington, D.C. So he was completely laid up for a year after that. And then when he came back to work, he, for the next several years, until the time he died, he had, seemed like every year or two he'd have another heart attack or a stroke and be laid up again for another long term. So Don and I really kind of got thrown into the leadership roles pretty early on because of his absence. And each time when he would come back, he would have some repercussions from the heart attack or the stroke that would either affect his eyes or something that he couldn't do things the way he used to. So when we came out of service, we both had kind of a running start to get into the management of the company because he was such a total part of that and now was absent. The business during the 30s and 40s consisted mainly of very small populated businesses, maybe 10 or 20 people. We also had an awful lot of gas stations that we had peanut machines in, and some even candy machines. And then when we got into the cigarette vending, then bars and restaurants became very predominant customers for us. But we didn't have any very large companies that we serviced. They were all pretty much smaller companies. After the war, things changed in the vending industry the same as it did in many other industries. As far as we were concerned, the thing that we saw was the wider acceptance of vending services. In the early days, vending was looked at as a interference to productivity, but there were many studies during the war that proved that some type of refreshment, particularly 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, increased productivity for the rest of the day. So that was something that when I was selling, I always had in my briefcase to show people that vending was not a productivity impediment.
Plus, at that time, the unions were getting pretty strong, and vending became one of their bargaining tools. They had to have them in some of the locations.
We no longer had gas stations and very small facilities. We got plants that were larger. The cigarette business expanded both in plants and in bars. We also got into some small cafeterias that we operated, that such as at McCord down on the Boulevard in Detroit, where we completely built, staffed it, and operated it very successfully. Having gotten our feet wet with some smaller cafeterias, we eventually start going off after some bigger fish, and we were very fortunate in securing the General Motors new Hamtramck plant for Cadillac when it opened. And later on went on to provide service for Mazda and Chrysler, and each one of these facilities would be feeding 4,000 or 5,000 people a day. So we would have a complete kitchen, and right at each site where with the chef there, they were very tough to control because having such a diverse population, they were always wanting something additional, and it was pretty tough to keep expanding your menu and still make a profit. A couple of other areas that we ventured into as new service opportunities is catering and janitorial service. The janitorial service we found didn't quite fit into our mode of operation. The catering service, of course, did, and that's something we've been doing for years very successfully. Since Variety's inception in 1920 up to 28, probably up to 1950, there were a lot of changes in the industry. We started off with just peanut and gum machines and single type vending candy machines, namely Hershey bars. And over the years, the machines changed where they gave you could make a selection.
Yeah, the candy machines in those days, the ones that Variety operated, were a machine probably about 8 or 10 inches wide, and the initial ones 54 inches from top to bottom. They were called U-Selected 54s, and that's where they got the U-Selected. U-Selected was the manufacturer. 54 was actually the length of the machine. The machine was a three-sided machine with a back that, or a four-sided machine, I'm sorry, but the back piece came off separately. So you would mount the back on a wall with 2 quarter-inch bolts, and in those days we used what they called an A&J anchor bolt, preferably on a cinder block wall or a brick wall. If it was a wood wall, we'd just use a quarter-inch lag nut, one on the top and one on the bottom, and then you would just hang the machine on that back, and there was a lock in the machine that would arm come down and catch into a latch on the back of the machine and lock it in place. Those were also carried in the cars when they were delivering for that very same reason. I would estimate that those machines probably weighed anywhere from 60 to 70 pounds. And I always marveled at the fact that my dad, who at that time, or at any time, was never more than 5'3" tall, and he would hoist them things up and hang them on there like anybody would pick up a picture and hang it on a wall. He had done so many of them. Vending machines prior to the war, as I remember them, I was only 11 years old when the war started, but I do remember the vending machines. Were relatively simple. They were basically single coin operated. By that I mean you either put in a penny, a nickel, or a dime, and that's what you paid for the product. They operated with a few springs and some levers, and as long as you got those in the right place all the time after you had serviced the machine, why, they worked quite well. The equipment after the war started to change, and it's changed quite rapidly. And of course there was many other changes as far as the equipment went. They were then just starting to come in with coin mechanisms that would make change, and which enabled you to not only make change, but then multiple pricing. Multiple pricing came along with that. So particularly on a candy machine or a snack machine, you didn't have to charge the same price for every item in it. If you had a little more expensive item, you could put it in the same machine and vend it from the same machine. There were, and then up until that point, most of the machines, although they were becoming electrified, it was micro switches and relays and that type of thing. Later years, of course, then they got into the electronics, and that changed the whole configuration of a machine again, and the things that you could do with it. Prior to that, we would always say you could fix a vending machine with a rubber band and a paper clip if you had to get you by and get you out of trouble for a while. Once they came along with all the electronics, of course, the paper clips and the rubber bands went by the wayside.
I'm frequently asked what changes took place in the industry that Variety's in, and it's probably too many to mention, but just to highlight a few things. The number of items that were made available for vending machines were expanded every year. There was more and more things that would become available.
A list of machines that Variety has dealt with over the years. The basic ones: peanuts, gum, candy, cigarette, ice cream, soda machines, cup soda, canned soda, bottled soda, coffee machines, from freeze-dry to ordinary ground coffee machines to coffee bean machines, milk machines, juice machines, food machines, canned food, hot canned food machines, hot dog machine, game machines of all kinds, pinballs, a couple of jukeboxes, music machines. We had a juice machine, a pure juice machine made by Welch's Grape Juice Company. It was only a two-selection machine, Welch's juice, grape juice, and lemonade.
Our services changed over the years, obviously, because of the both customer demand and also the type of new vending services, vending machines that were on the market. We saw the introduction of a cup soda vending machine, which was a whole new concept. There was the introduction of coffee vending machines.
Coffee vendors, our very first coffee vending machines were what they called a freeze-dry coffee machine. It dispensed freeze-dry coffee into mixing bowl, shoot the hot water into the mixing bowl, and of course into the cup, and made a reasonably good, decent cup of coffee. And then a few years later, came along with a fresh brewed coffee machine. You actually could put ground coffee into the machine. It would dispense the ground coffee into a bowl, mixed with hot water and air pressure to push it through, and improve the quality of the coffee considerably.
We would accidentally leave one of the empty cans sit on top of the coffee machine after we serviced it, so people could see it and open it and smell it. And usually by the next time you came in, somebody made some comment about, somebody said that's real coffee you use in there. Of course we'd say, it is.
And then they came along with coffee machines that you could actually use coffee beans, which meant that the coffee would not get as stale as fast as it did just the ground coffee in the machine. So you'd put it had a little coffee grinder. The beans would be dispensed into the grinder. It would grind them, drop them into a mixing bowl, and bring the hot water and coffee, cream, or cream or sugar along with it. So you could serve a very good cup of coffee with cream and sugar or without.
And then later on, the food vending machine was introduced, which opened us to a new category or customer, so to speak.
We started with one food machine, and of course, in those days, a food machine was nothing more than a machine full of sandwiches, and primarily cold cuts, lunch meat sandwiches. Mother started making those home in the kitchen. The day before, Dad would tell her what he thought we needed for the next day, and she would make them at home, and he would take them from the house. And of course, then you had to make sure that was the very first location you went to.
And getting into food vending meant you also had to get into the microwave business, because you had to supply microwave heating for people who bought items out of the food machine that need to be heated up. And also because you were getting into higher price selling items, it meant that you had to put dollar bill changers anywhere you had a food machine. So a food machine became a very expensive operation. There was no profit to be made from it.
Another major part in my life was forming a board of directors. Up until that time, I never gave a thought to anything like that. Ken and I had gone a few months prior to forming that board. We had gone to a small family business seminar in Ohio, and we didn't know what we were getting into when we went down there, what it was going to be like. It was all family business people at the seminar. And after the first day, we went down to eat dinner, and when we did, we walked in the dining room, and the young fellow who was putting on the seminar at the time, a fellow named John Ward, was sitting at a table by himself, and he invited us over to sit down with him. And we did. And one of the first questions he asked was, well, what do you think? And both Ken and I said, well, it's a little different than what we had thought. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, there's several families here who didn't sit together. They're scattered around. And he just smiled. And he said, there's more than several. He says, and probably you're one of the few that isn't split up. And he said, that's basically the reason they're here. He said, they've got a lot of family problems in their business. He said, you're very unique. He said, you don't have, and he started naming off all kinds of different problems. That was really a eye-opening experience for me, because up till then, I thought all family businesses were like Variety.
Couple of high points during Variety's many years would be, I think, first of all, to move out to Warren into a building that was probably 3 or 4 times the size of the building we were previously in Detroit. It was up until that time, we had just been renting different facilities, and this was a purchase of our own building, and one that was going to hopefully allow us to grow, because it was a very good size. So that certainly was a milestone for us. Another milestone for us would be when we broke the barrier and became recognized as a competitor of national companies. For many years, essentially only national companies serviced the big 3. Well, that changed when we became the supplier for the General Motors Hamtramck facility. And of course, later on, we also did and still do business with Ford, Mazda, and Chrysler. So those were big changes, because it was you don't get any bigger clients than them, and to have them on your client list is really a substantial credential, because there were no other independent companies that were considered eligible bidders for those size pieces of business.
I think for myself, probably the biggest milestone was acquiring the General Motors Cadillac plant in Hamtramck, known then as the Poletown plant. It was a brand new plant. It was the first time that any independent vendor had ever gotten into one of the big 3 plants, and it was an altogether new experience for everybody, and to me that was a real milestone, and probably what helped make it a milestone was a good milestone. That was the employees that we had at the time, and the people, the way they were willing to do whatever had to be done to get this account, and then after we got it, to keep it. That was a real milestone.
Speaking of General Motors, we have another little unique distinction in that after about 5 years of servicing General Motors, they breached the contract with us, and we sued them. It took about 5 years to go through the legal process, and we won it, but it was kind of a hollow victory because of the amount of damages that the court determined was significantly less than what we and our attorneys had thought was the correct amount. Chuck Bryden served as our president After I retired and before John was elevated to the CEO, Chuck was very important because the board wanted to get outside experience for some of the younger NOACs who are now actively in the business today, because with the exception of Gene, nobody had any experience working outside the company. And they felt that they couldn't afford to have them all go outside to gain this experience because they were needed in the company. So the board came up with a very brilliant idea of having me retire early, bring in somebody from the outside so that the family members would not be working for their dad or their uncle, and they would get the outside experience right within their present job. Chuck Bryden fitted perfectly because one of the assignments that they wanted was not only to give experience to the young people, but it was going to be Chuck's responsibility to recommend a successor when his term expired. He had a very important job, and he did it very excellently while he was with us. I've been asked more than once, how does a family business differ from a non-family business, or how does a family business benefit a family? From the standpoint of the advantages of a family business is that you have stability and trust among family that you don't have between just co-workers.
I think it has brought, particularly the boys, much closer together than they would have been or would be if they were all out working someplace else.
We still have holiday dinners with the family, and all the family is there. Nobody's in California, nobody's in Colorado, nobody's in New Jersey. They're all in metropolitan Detroit.
And I know it brought my wife into the business indirectly, because every night, particularly Dan and Ken, when they went home, first thing they did was tell her everything that went on at Variety all day, because I would come home and she would start asking questions about things and finally I said, what makes you ask all these questions? She said, well, the boys just brought them up when they come home. They tell me everything that's going on during the day. I think it made us a much tighter-knit family than most families.
Running a family business also comes with a number of distinct challenges. When kids grow up together and then they get into business and one's at a higher level than the other one, it's sometimes hard to communicate and relate the way you should.
In my mind, they never left home. I saw them every day, or almost every day. That to me has always been a blessing, because I saw with my wife Bea and with other women have a very difficult time when everybody leaves home, leaves the house. I never experienced that. I think that was a definite advantage. If someone were to ask me what it takes to maintain a family business as long as Variety has been maintained, I would have to say a lot of hard work, a lot of honesty, and a lot of perseverance.
So what has made Variety so successful over this past almost 90 years? I think it can be summarized with just 3 words: integrity, pride, and perseverance.
As you can see, there's quite a few good reasons for teaming up with Variety.
I think that's too loud. Turn that TV. There's no light on this. What lights are on in here?
This one.
Just one?
This one. It's pointing towards us now.
Yeah, I know. The total. By removing this light, it's better, but that's not right. Keeping it wrong. It's supposed to. There.
A big operation. We've never done anything like that before, that the amount of equipment and what have you. But anyway, Dad and Bill decided that it was a golden opportunity, so they did it, and they did. Ollie then went to run that operation, and he did. He was over there for several years, as long as we had the account, and worked right out of his house. He went from his house right to Turnstead, had a small room over there for a warehouse, and worked right out of the plant. Came Saturdays and picked up whatever he was going to need for the week and took it out and stocked it in the warehouse.
So I couldn't overlay it would be 10 o'clock. I don't know if the spaces were seated. And wanted to be out here by 10:30.
Yeah.
Another appointment.
Well,
Michael, this director is
could have had a blanket though, but you don't.
What? I was gonna record him, but then I noticed that there's too much room between his head and top of the frame. All right, you're gonna sit right there.
Yep, that's it.
Okay. Recorders. All right, snap it, please. Remove this jacket.
All right, take two.
Shirt a little bit too.
Yeah.
I'm gonna pull your shirt down some, okay?
We gotta make sure you look good.
Darn right.
We'll
I
get
was
some.
gonna say, if you have any clips.
Yes.
and-
We could do clips.
What we do in photography, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Put your back, or, yeah, pull
Cheating,
your back
yeah.
away, sorry, I'm trying
That looks
to,
good.
there you go.
All right, we on check. Looks good.
What? I yawned a
Did you
little.
go to bed last night again?
I yawned a little bit, so what? I'm behind the scenes, I don't need to be here.
Why is it always my video the day after you don't
Oh,
get
come
sleep?
on, oh, come on.
Alright, I'll
All
put
right,
it on.
we all recording?
Not while he was at the University of Detroit, but, or I should say not for the University of Detroit, but my dad was quite a basketball player. He played for a team from St. Elizabeth's in downtown Detroit who were very well known for their basketball talents. And they played all around the city and occasionally out in some of the other areas, but primarily around the city. But they were well known for that. And he in particular was known as one of the better of any of the players in basketball, even though he was only 5'3" tall. Number one, they didn't have any giants like we have today in basketball. They were all shorter, of course, but 5'3" was pretty short for basketball. But he became a extraordinarily good dribbler, and he could run circles around most different players on the court. I don't know, he never talked about being a good high scorer. He did score, obviously, but not high. But he was a real team player and would get the ball down in near the basket and get it to somebody who could put it in. Dad was as we said, was an accountant. He was a excellent mechanic. He was a good personnel man. He got along very well with all his employees. But he was also a very innovative guy. And he came up with a design for a box, which was probably, I'd say maybe 1.5 by 2 foot square. And he had 6 dividers in it. There were 6 compartments in it. The machines we were using in those days were called a U-Selected, and it had a conveyor with buckets on it, as they were called, and there were 3 different whisks or heists on the end of that bucket, because candy bars came in basically 3 different sizes. There was the Hershey bar that was a very thin bar. There were Mounds and Almond Joys that were a little thicker. There was a Payday bar, which was a lot thicker. So you had what we called a small, medium, and large bucket. Dad designed this box so that you could, this woman was named Clara Fox. She would pack those boxes during the day so that the next morning the drivers would have them and could take them with them. And they would take a box into a location. So they would have enough small bars, medium bars, and big bars to fill a machine which held 72 bars at that time. Prior to that, they would have to take in a box of Hershey's, a box of this, box of that, box of whatever, to individual boxes, very cumbersome. So now all they had to do was pick up one of these boxes and take the one box in there. He had enough for that location and back out to the truck. He designed that box, and in fact, I don't know if he ever sold them to some other operators here in the Detroit area, but I know some others copied it. I don't think he ever actually sold them to them, but they did copy it. And back on that same subject of innovation, on that particular candy machine, as I say, it was a conveyor, so that the conveyor was about 72 inches long, and it was in a machine that was a little over 72 inches in height and about maybe 8-9 inches square. So the conveyor was going up and around the top and down and up from the bottom. It had a shield on the top and the bottom, so when it made the turn, the bar wouldn't fall out. But it was a solid piece of metal. And particularly in the summertime, Hershey bars in particular, and other thin bars like that, and chocolate bars, would wrapper get tore a little or what have you. The chocolate would get out, get all over that. Peanut bags would break and peanuts lay in there, and they were dragging them around through that conveyor. He designed that shield that held the bar in the conveyor so that anything that might have come out of it would fall through the shield and not let the bar come out. He showed it to the manufacturer rep one day, and he said, "Oh, yeah," he said, "but that's not a big problem. You don't have to worry about that." So he forgot about it. About, I think, the next shipment of machines that we got, or maybe the second shipment, all had shields on the conveyor as he had designed.
We had a period where it was very tough to get employees. We had an incentive program if any of our employees made a referral, and we hired that person. They would get a finder's fee, which had some positive effect, but still didn't fill our need. We were growing pretty rapidly, and we needed competent people. One day I was reading a newspaper, and I read about a bakery called Mills. It was located in Detroit and was going out of business. So I called over there and talked to the general manager and introduced myself and asked him if I said we were hiring, and if he had any employees that he would like to recommend for hire, that he should send them over. Well, he did. He sent 3 or 4 guys, and they were all just crackerjacks. They liked root work. They liked being outside. They liked being their own boss. They were good with customers, and so forth. So, in spite of the hiring of them, we still, a few months later, were in need of more people. So I asked them if there wasn't somebody that they knew. Well, they told me up to 2 guys, but they said they would be real good, but they're still with Mills. They kept their job with Mills. So I found out from them where their roots were at. So a couple times a week, I would drive through one of the 2 routes, and invariably I would see the Mills truck. So I'd stop and buy something from the guy. So after doing that for about a week or 2, the guy kind of got to know me a little bit, and I asked him if he would ever consider changing jobs. And to make a long story short, I hired both of them over a period of probably 6 weeks. Were, again, just very excellent people. One of the things that we did do with one of the local school districts, Warren Woods High School, was we worked with them in the development of a vending technician program. The industry was always short of technical people to maintain the vending machines, and likewise the school district was interested in teaching some practical skills to kids that weren't figuring on going to college, and so they worked with us in establishing a program that the trained vending mechanics, and the guy who taught it was very much into it. He was very thorough. He started the program by taking the students all up to the electric pole outside the school and pointing up to that and saying, this is where it all starts, right here. And then he would go in and start getting into the vending machines and how they worked and how you repaired them and so forth. And we worked in cooperation with them for a number of years in terms of providing them with updated machines so that the students were working with current equipment and so forth. But it was also very helpful to us in terms of getting students who are getting graduates from the class that were, very technically competent. The vending technology changed over the years substantially. In the early days, everything was mechanical. Later years, it became electrified and electronic and became increasingly more dependable with the advent of the new technology. You no longer had springs and counterweights and things to deal with. You now had microchips that were doing the job of many moving parts that could get dirty and malfunction. Speaking of, getting into new things, we did try at one time for a few years getting into the amusement game business and pool tables and video games and things of that nature. But we quickly learned that the people that were requesting this equipment were only requesting it for how much money they could make off it. They weren't concerned about whether you had 24-hour service or how good your equipment was or how honest you were. And there were even some underworld elements that came into the business, and we were competing with them, and it just became apparent to us that there was no future to hang in there. And so after a few years, we abandoned that segment of the business.
One of the big jobs we had then was baling paper. Most of the product came in small cardboard corrugated boxes, and we created a lot of paper, a lot of scrap paper. And so my dad purchased a baling machine. You would have to break the boxes down, get them flat, put them in this machine, and then it had a big metal cover on it that you would close and crank down, compress it as tight as you could, and then you slid a wire band around a track on the machine that actually took it in and wound it around the cardboard itself. Twisted it half a dozen or more times together, and then cranked it open, and of course the compression of the paper popping back up made it a nice tight bundle, and pull it out of there and stack it in the back of the building until you had half a dozen or more, and then the scrap paper people would come and pick it up, sell it to them for scrap. Did that many nights after school. I then went in service in '51. I was in for 2 years, came out in '53, and planned on taking a little vacation. However, at that time there was the mechanic that my dad had at that time, a fellow named Bork, Mr. Bork, had been planning a vacation. He knew when I was getting out of service, so he planned his vacation so that the week I got out of service, he went on vacation. So needless to say, I went right back to work.